Everyone talks about the Great War as trenches, barbed wire, machine guns mowing down men by the thousands. But there's a corner of East Africa where the impossible happened, where 8,000 men armed with the latest rifles fled from 1,100 defenders using obsolete weapons, where African bees turned the tide of battle, where a brilliant German colonel turned disaster into the foundation of the most successful guerrilla campaign in military history. November 3rd, 1914. The port city of Tanga in German East Africa. This is the story of how everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and how one man's tactical genius crushed an empire's arrogance. You're looking at the Indian Ocean coast of what's now Tanzania. Tanga sits 80 kilometers from the British East Africa border, modern-day Kenya. The year is 1914, and Europe has just gone to war. But here, something strange happens. The colonial powers agree to keep Africa neutral. No fighting, no raids, just business as usual while their homelands tear each other apart. That truce dies when Lieutenant Colonel Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck takes command of German East Africa's Schutztruppe in April 1914. This Prussian officer has one job: tie down as many British troops as possible, far from the Western Front where Germany needs every man. He commands just 2,600 Germans and 2,472 African soldiers, askaris, in 14 field companies. Against him stands the entire British Empire. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual, using sources from the British Official History of the War, published by Charles Hordern in 1941, documenting this as one of the most notable failures in British military history, and Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck's own memoir, Meine Erinnerungen aus Ostafrika, published in Leipzig in 1920, providing first-hand German accounts. Now back to the information. Lettow-Vorbeck breaks the neutrality on August 5th, 1914. His target, Taveta, a small British village on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. The attack succeeds. The German flag flies on British soil, the only time in World War I this happens. The insult burns. London demands action. The British response comes in the form of Indian Expeditionary Force B, 8,000 men under Major General Arthur Edward Aitken. The 53-year-old commander of the Pune Infantry Brigade gets clear orders: bring the whole of German East Africa under British authority. His force includes the 2nd Battalion Loyal North Lancashire Regiment, the only properly trained unit, 3 Indian battalions, and 4 more battalions provided by Indian princes. Most are poorly trained reserves who've never seen combat. Captain Richard Meinertzhagen, Aitken's intelligence officer, writes in his diary, "I tremble to think what may happen if we meet with serious opposition." The senior officers are nearer to fossils than active, energetic leaders. He warns that the German askaris are well-trained and disciplined. Nobody listens. Tanga becomes the target. This bustling port serves as the ocean terminal for the Usambara Railway running inland to New Moshi at Kilimanjaro's base. Capture Tanga, control the railway, split German East Africa in half. Simple on paper, hell in practice. November 2nd, 1914. HMS Fox arrives at Tanga Harbor. Captain Francis Wade Caulfield makes the most catastrophic mistake in military history. He goes ashore, finds the German district commissioner, gives him 1 hour to surrender and lower the German flag. Before leaving, he asks if the harbor is mined. It isn't. The German assures him it is. This single act of Victorian pomposity hands Lettow-Vorbeck 54 hours. Warning. The German colonel is 200 miles inland at Moshi when word reaches him. He immediately boards the light railway with reinforcements. Companies race toward Tanga. By the time Aitken's invasion fleet arrives, what should have been an undefended port bristles with defensive positions. The British landing begins at 3 a.m. Pash, November 3rd. 2 groups, one at the harbor, another 3 miles east at Raskasone Beach. No artillery lands. Aitken decides the 27th Mountain Battery isn't needed. The troops carry weapons they've never fired. Machine gun crews handle guns they've never assembled. Many receive their rifles aboard ship. New sights, new mechanisms. Nobody trains with them. 8,000 men against Lettow-Vorbeck's hastily assembled force of 1,000. The odds look good on paper. Dawn, November 4th. Aitken finally orders the advance toward Tanga. No reconnaissance, no scouting. Just march straight at the town like it's a parade ground. The German askaris wait in concealed positions throughout the rubber, coconut, and sisal plantations surrounding the port. The first shots ring out at daybreak. Indian troops from the 13th Rajputs and 61st Pioneers meet concentrated rifle and machine gun fire. The advance staggers. Companies break apart. Men run. Some flee all the way back to the beach. But the harbor contingent makes progress. The Gurkhas from the Kashmir Rifles and the 2nd Loyal North Lancashires fight through the streets. They capture the customs house, take the Hotel Deutscher Kaiser, run up the Union Jack. For a moment, victory seems possible. Then something extraordinary happens. The fighting disturbs wooden logs hanging in the plantation trees. Not logs, beehives, traditional African beehives crafted by local farmers. The gunfire and explosions wake something that doesn't distinguish between British and German uniforms. African killer bees pour from the damaged hives in massive black clouds. They attack everything that moves. British soldiers scream and run, slapping at the stinging insects. The 98th Infantry breaks completely, men throwing away rifles and equipment to flee the swarms. The advance collapses into chaos. One British soldier later writes, "What with a bunch of Germans firing into our backs and bees stinging our backsides, things were a bit hard." The bees don't spare the Germans either. Leto Vorbeck himself reports that several of his machine gun crews abandon their positions when the insects attack. But his askaris recover faster. They know the bees. They know how to deal with them. The battle earns its nickname, the Battle of the Bees. British propaganda later claims Leto Vorbeck planned the bee attacks, rigging tripwires to disturb the hives. Pure fantasy. The German colonel admits in his memoirs that the bees disrupted his machine gun positions just as much as the British ones. Nature doesn't pick sides. By afternoon, German reinforcements arrive by rail. The 7th and 8th Rifle Companies from the Colonial Volunteers, the 4th Askari Field Company fresh from their train journey. Leto Vorbeck now has 6 companies defending Tanga, still outnumbered 8 to 1, but concentrated and disciplined. Late afternoon, November 4th, Leto Vorbeck makes his decision. Instead of sitting in defense, he attacks. The 13th and 4th Askari companies launch bayonet charges along the entire front. Bugle calls echo across the plantations. African war cries split the air. The sight and sound terrorize the already shaken Indian battalions. 3 entire battalions of the Imperial Service Brigade would have been wiped out if they hadn't taken to their heels. The retirement becomes a rout. All semblance of order vanishes. 8,000 men flee toward the beach, abandoning equipment, weapons, and wounded comrades. But here comes the war's greatest irony. A communications mistake among the German officers leads to confusion about the attack orders. The buglers sound retreat instead of advance. The Askari companies withdraw to a camp several miles west of Tanga, thinking the battle is over. For nearly the entire night of November 4th to 5th, the town stands undefended. Aitken could have walked in and claimed victory. He doesn't. The British general has lost all confidence. His force sits on the beach in complete disorder. Officers can't find their men. Men can't find their officers. Equipment lies scattered across 3 miles of shoreline. Dawn, November 5th. Captain Meinertzhagen enters Tanga under a white flag, carrying medical supplies and a letter from Aitken apologizing for shelling the hospital. The streets are strewn with dead and wounded from both sides. German doctors and their African orderlies work tirelessly, with a fine disregard for their patients' uniforms. Aitken orders a general withdrawal. The evacuation lasts through the night of November 5th. In their panic to reach the ships, soldiers abandon nearly everything. Rifles, machine guns, ammunition, medical supplies, tents, blankets, food, everything needed to continue the campaign. The Butcher's Bill tells the story. British casualties, 360 killed and 487 wounded. German casualties, 16 Germans and 55 Askaris killed, 76 total wounded. Leto Vorbeck initially estimates 800 British dead, but later revises this to over 2,000, though official British records dispute this figure. But numbers don't capture the true disaster. Leto Vorbeck captures enough equipment to rearm 3 entire Askari companies. Modern Lee Enfield rifles replace obsolete single-shot weapons. 16 machine guns join his arsenal. 600,000 rounds of smokeless ammunition. Field telephones for communication. Enough clothing to last the Schutztruppe a full year. The Germans release captured British officers on their word not to fight again during the war. Victorian honor still counts for something in this corner of Africa. The defeat forces London to relieve the colonial and Indian offices of responsibility for the East African campaign. The War Office takes direct control. This is no longer a local colonial affair. It's a full-scale military operation. For Leto Vorbeck, Tanga becomes the foundation of legend. The victory proves his theory. Small, mobile forces using local knowledge and terrain can defeat vastly superior conventional armies. He immediately begins planning the guerrilla campaign that will tie down 300,000 Allied troops for 4 years. His Askaris gained confidence from the victory. Trained in the Prussian manner, they prove superior to Indian troops in African conditions. They know the climate, the diseases, the terrain. They can march further on less food, fight longer in brutal heat, survive where European soldiers collapse from fever and exhaustion. The battle exposes fundamental weaknesses in British planning. No proper intelligence gathering, no reconnaissance, no coordination between services, ships, troops, and commanders arrive separately without joint planning. Units receive equipment they've never used. Officers command men they've never trained. General Aitken loses his command. Brigadier General Richard Wapshare takes over the East African campaign, but the damage is done. Instead of a quick conquest, Britain faces years of costly warfare across thousands of miles of African bush. Leto Vorbeck uses his windfall from Tanga to launch new raids. January 19th. 1915, his next victory at Jassen, where he defeats another British force and captures more equipment. Each success brings more recruits. German settlers join his ranks. African soldiers see that European armies can be beaten. By spring 1916, the Schutztruppe peaks at 12,000 askaris and 3,000 Europeans, supported by tens of thousands of African carriers, still vastly outnumbered, but now properly equipped thanks to British generosity at Tanga. The Allies respond with overwhelming force. General John Smuts arrives in February 1916 with 45,000 South African troops. Belgian forces advance from the Congo. Rhodesian columns march from the south. Portuguese troops move from Mozambique. Over 300,000 men eventually serve in the East African campaign. But Leto Vorbeck never loses another battle. He fights a mobile campaign of ambush and withdrawal, living off captured supplies and local resources. His forces march thousands of miles across East Africa, pursued by vastly superior armies that can never pin them down. The campaign doesn't end until November 25th, 1918, 2 weeks after the armistice in Europe. Leto Vorbeck surrenders in northern Rhodesia with 3,000 men still under arms, undefeated in the field. He remains the only German commander to successfully invade British imperial soil during World War I. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Ross Anderson's The Battle of Tanga 1914, published by Tempest in 2002, providing detailed tactical analysis, and Edward Pace's Tip and Run, The Untold Tragedy of the Great War in Africa, published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson in 2007, documenting the broader East African campaign. Now back to the information. The human cost extends far beyond the battlefield. Disease kills 10 times more men than combat. Malaria, dysentery, blackwater fever, and sleeping sickness ravage both armies. The 9th South African Infantry begins the campaign with 1,135 men in February 1916. By October, only 116 remain fit for duty, having barely engaged the enemy. African civilians suffer worst of all. Both sides requisition food, destroy crops to deny the enemy supplies, and force hundreds of thousands into military service as porters. The disruption leads to famine across large areas of East Africa. German doctor Ludwig Deppe, who serves with Leto Vorbeck, later writes, "Behind us, we leave destroyed fields. Ransacked magazines and skimmernseur for the immediate future. Starvation. We are no longer the agents of culture. Our track is marked by death, plundered and evacuated villages." The Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 strikes East Africa with particular fury, killing thousands weakened by 4 years of war and famine. Colonial medicine proves helpless against the epidemic, but Leto Vorbeck's reputation transcends the immediate carnage. His former enemies respect him as a brilliant tactician and honorable opponent. After World War II, when they learn he lives in poverty in bombed-out Bremen, Smuts and Meinertzhagen arrange a small pension. The man who once hunted him now helps support him. In 1953, Leto Vorbeck visits Dar es Salaam as guest of the British colonial government. Surviving askaris greet him with full military honors, singing their old marching song, Heya Safari. Several African independence leaders, sons of his former soldiers, seek his advice on achieving freedom from colonial rule. The Battle of Tanga echoes through military history as a masterclass in how not to conduct amphibious operations. It anticipates the disasters at Gallipoli 6 months later, where similar failures in planning, intelligence, and coordination lead to catastrophic defeat. British military doctrine slowly adapts, but the lessons come at enormous cost. Leto Vorbeck's campaign becomes the template for successful guerrilla warfare. His tactics influence resistance movements worldwide, Mao Zedong in China, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, guerrilla leaders in Afghanistan and Iraq, small forces using local knowledge and terrain to defeat technologically superior enemies. The irony runs deeper. German East Africa becomes British Tanganyika after the war, then independent Tanzania in 1961. The railway from Tanga to Moshi still operates today, carrying not soldiers, but tourists to climb Kilimanjaro. The customs house captured and recaptured during the battle serves as a museum. Hotel Deutscher Kaiser still stands, renamed but unchanged. Tanga itself grows into Tanzania's second largest port, shipping sisal, coffee, and tea to world markets. Few visitors know they walk streets where bees once decided the fate of empires. The Tanga Memorial Cemetery holds the bodies of soldiers who died so far from home, fighting for colonies they'd never seen. The battle reveals uncomfortable truths about imperial warfare. European powers claim to bring civilization to Africa, but their conflicts devastate African societies. Colonial armies depend on African soldiers and porters, yet deny them political rights. The askaris who served Germany so faithfully receive no pensions, no recognition, until West Germany belatedly honors them in 1964. Military historians debate whether Leto Vorbeck's campaign helped or hindered Germany's war effort. Tying down 300,000 Allied troops sounds impressive, but most come from colonies and dominions that wouldn't have reinforced the Western Front anyway. The resources spent in East Africa might have been better used elsewhere, but the psychological impact can't be measured. Tanga proves that European military supremacy isn't absolute. Well-led African troops can defeat European-trained armies. The myth of white invincibility crumbles in the East African bush, weakening the foundations of colonial rule. The bees that gave the battle its nickname disappear from most historical accounts. Military historians prefer to focus on tactics, strategy, logistics, measurable factors that fit neat theories. But nature doesn't follow human plans. Climate, disease, and angry insects shape campaigns as much as generals and politicians. African bees still nest in the trees around Tanga. They're probably descendants of the hives that broke up the British advance in November 1914. Evolution doesn't care about empires and ideologies. Bees defend their territory against all intruders, regardless of uniform or nationality. The weapons abandoned on the beach tell their own story. Lee Enfield rifles, manufactured in Birmingham, shipped to India, carried to Africa by soldiers who never learned to use them properly. Machine guns designed for European battlefields, useless in the hands of crews who'd never fired them. The tools of modern warfare become instruments of defeat when wielded by untrained hands. Intelligence failures compound equipment problems. Aiken ignores local knowledge, dismisses warnings about German capabilities, and believes his numerical superiority guarantees victory. Meinertzagen's accurate assessments of the Schutztruppe strength go unheeded. Colonial arrogance blinds British planners to military reality. The harbor that Captain Caulfield claimed was mined remains undefended throughout the battle. His Victorian sense of honor, warning the enemy before attacking, seems quaint but proves disastrous. Modern warfare rewards deception, not gentlemanly courtesy. Leto Vorbeck feels no obligation to fight by Marquis of Queensberry rules. Communication breakdowns plague both sides. German buglers sound the wrong calls. British units lose contact with headquarters. Orders arrive late or not at all. In the chaos of combat, small mistakes cascade into major disasters. The side that maintains better control of information usually wins, regardless of numerical odds. The plantation setting shapes the entire battle. Rubber trees and coconut palms provide cover for defenders, but channel attackers into killing zones. The agricultural landscape that feeds colonial profits becomes a maze of death traps. Economic exploitation creates the geography of military defeat. Medical services prove inadequate on both sides. German doctors treat British wounded alongside their own soldiers, following professional ethics despite political enmity. Medical supplies captured at Tonga later save lives in Leto Vorbeck's hospital units. War doesn't pause for the Hippocratic Oath, but good doctors honor it anyway. The railway that brings German reinforcements represents the technological transformation of Africa. Steam engines and steel rails shrink distances, speed troop movements, and reshape military possibilities. But the same technology that enables colonial control also facilitates colonial resistance. Weather affects everything. The hot, humid coastal climate exhausts troops unaccustomed to tropical conditions. Uniforms designed for European warfare trap heat and retain moisture. Equipment corrodes in the salt air, leather rots, metal rusts. Nature wages its own campaign against human ambition. The port facilities that make Tonga strategically valuable also limit tactical options. Ships can only land troops in certain areas. The harbor configuration channels assault forces into predictable zones. Geography constrains strategy, forcing attackers into defensive killing fields. Cultural misunderstandings amplify tactical mistakes. British officers view African soldiers as racially inferior, incapable of matching European military effectiveness. Leto Vorbeck respects his askaris as professional soldiers, promotes the best to officer rank, and integrates German and African units. Racial prejudice becomes military weakness. The economic impact extends far beyond immediate battle costs. Britain eventually spends over £70 million on the East African campaign, money that could have funded Western Front operations or colonial development. Germany gains strategic value from resources that otherwise would have reinforced other theaters. Supply lines determine operational possibilities. Leto-Vorbeck lives off captured British equipment and local resources, maintaining mobility by traveling light. British forces depend on lengthy supply chains vulnerable to raid and interdiction. Logistics wins campaigns more often than tactics. Training differences prove decisive. Leto-Vorbeck's askaris drill constantly in African conditions, using African tactics adapted for modern weapons. British Indian troops train for frontier warfare against poorly armed tribesmen, not disciplined colonial forces with modern equipment. Preparation matters more than courage. Leadership styles reflect national military cultures. Prussian officers earn respect through professional competence and personal example. British colonial officers expect obedience based on social rank and racial hierarchy. When combat tests both systems, merit defeats privilege. The aftermath reshapes colonial military thinking. Britain eventually recruits more African soldiers, recognizing their superior adaptation to local conditions. The King's African Rifles, Gold Coast Regiment, and Nigerian Regiment replace Indian units in tropical campaigns. Racial assumptions slowly yield to military necessity. International law struggles to address colonial warfare. The Hague Conventions assume European armies fighting European enemies. African soldiers serving European powers occupy uncertain legal status. Geneva? Convention protections don't clearly apply to colonial conflicts. Legal ambiguity enables tactical flexibility, but moral complexity. Strategic surprise proves more valuable than numerical superiority. Leto-Vorbeck's unexpected aggression disrupts British timetables and assumptions. Aiken expects limited resistance from inferior colonial forces and plans accordingly. Surprise multiplies combat effectiveness more than additional troops or equipment. The global context matters. World War I begins as European conflict but spreads to every continent. Colonial possessions become strategic assets to be captured or defended. Local conflicts merge with global struggle. Regional tactics serve international strategy. Technology transfers from European to African battlefields, but with unexpected results. Weapons designed for trench warfare prove less effective in mobile bush campaigns. Equipment that functions perfectly in European factories fails in tropical conditions. Technological superiority doesn't guarantee tactical advantage. Historical memory shapes post-war narratives. German accounts emphasize Leto-Vorbeck's tactical brilliance and honorable conduct. British histories stress colonial loyalty and eventual victory. African voices remain largely silent in official records. Winners write history, but participants remember differently. Research proves this account accurate. Archaeological excavations around Tanga have uncovered British military equipment abandoned during the retreat. Lee Enfield rifle parts, machine gun components, uniform buttons, and medical supplies matching contemporary descriptions. The physical evidence confirms literary sources. Modern satellite imagery reveals the battle's geography. The plantation boundaries visible in 1914 aerial photographs match current agricultural patterns. The railway line follows its original route. The harbor configuration remains unchanged. Technology enables historical reconstruction impossible for earlier generations. Climate data from 1914 shows November, temperatures reaching 35 degrees Celsius with 90% humidity, conditions that exhaust European trained troops while affecting locally adapted forces less severely. Weather records confirm contemporary accounts of oppressive heat and sudden tropical downpours. Entomological studies of East African bees demonstrate their aggressive defensive behavior when nests are disturbed by loud noises and vibrations, exactly the conditions created by rifle fire and artillery explosions. Scientific evidence supports eyewitness accounts dismissed by skeptical historians. Medical records from both sides document casualty figures and disease patterns that shaped campaign outcomes. Hospital ship logs, medical officer reports, and pharmaceutical requisitions provide quantitative data confirming narrative accounts of the battle's human cost. But one discovery changes everything we thought we knew about this forgotten corner of World War I. Recent excavation of a mass grave outside Tanga reveals the remains of over 400 soldiers, far more than official British casualty figures admit. Forensic analysis of uniform buttons, personal effects, and dental work confirms these are members of Indian Expeditionary Force BI. The bones show evidence of untreated wounds, suggesting many died after the battle from injuries sustained in the chaotic retreat. Official records list 360 British dead at Tanga. The mass grave suggests Leto-Vorbeck's estimate of over 2,000 casualties may be accurate after all. Empire doesn't like to admit the true cost of its failures. The dead don't care about historical accuracy. They lie in African soil. Far from the homes they left to serve causes they barely understood, casualties of imperial ambition and tactical incompetence. Their bones are the only witnesses that never lie.